Darkness enveloped him as they led him to the square. There was only one thing: silence. Suffocating and cold. The air buzzed with an eerie energy, and then, from the shadows, a figure emerged, silent, unseen. It drew closer. From the darkness came a chilling whisper. "You've said more than you should." Ismail was a teenager, born and raised in Somalia, in a family deeply rooted in the traditions of Islam. From an early age, he was taught to respect the elders, to follow the rules of his faith without question, and to live in a manner that upheld the values of his community. His days followed a predictable pattern: school, home, prayers, religious holidays, and interactions with family and community members who all held the same beliefs. The rhythm of his life was set by these routines, and he never questioned the structure that was in place. As Ismail grew older, however, there was a shift that began to stir quietly within him. It wasn't a sudden transformation, nor was it a drastic rebellion. It was more of a gentle questioning, a curiosity that bloomed silently in the corners of his mind. He had always been taught that Islam was the only true path, that anything outside of it was heresy, and that to entertain other beliefs was a dangerous step towards straying from the right path. Still, Ismail couldn't help but wonder about the world beyond his own faith, about the other religions and their philosophies, their rituals, their sense of connection to the divine. He had heard whispers of Christianity, mostly from the few foreigners who had visited Somalia in recent years, sharing stories of their faith. They spoke of a man named Jesus, a figure revered as the Son of God, someone who preached love, forgiveness, and salvation. At first, Ismail listened with a polite interest, unsure of what to make of these teachings. Christianity was foreign to him, and his elders had made it clear that such beliefs were misguided. Yet, despite the warnings, a part of Ismail was captivated by the kindness and the warmth he had heard described. He didn't know it at the time, but this innocent curiosity would begin a journey that would shake the very foundation of his identity. In his school, there were a few classmates who were outspoken about their interest in Christianity. Some of them had been exposed to missionaries or had family members who were Christians, and they spoke of their beliefs freely. It was a stark contrast to the environment Ismail was accustomed to, one where religion was not just a part of life, but the very core of existence. His curiosity began to deepen as he heard more from his classmates, some of whom spoke with passion about the love they felt through their faith, the peace that came from embracing Christ, and the freedom they experienced in their spiritual lives. Despite this curiosity, Ismail remained cautious. His family was strict, and the societal pressure in Somalia was unrelenting. To even entertain the idea of questioning Islam was unthinkable. It wasn't just a religious sin. It was a betrayal to everything he had known and loved. But in his heart, there was a flicker of something new, a desire to understand more, to learn about this faith that seemed so different, yet strangely appealing. One day, an event occurred in Ismail's school that would set the course for everything to come. They were having a religious studies class, and the teacher asked the students to share their thoughts on other world religions. The question itself seemed innocent enough, and the other students spoke freely, some expressing admiration for certain aspects of other faiths, while others simply stated that they didn't believe in them. When the question was posed to Ismail, he felt an overwhelming urge to speak up. He knew this was a risky move, that it could bring trouble for him. But something inside him couldn't remain silent. With hesitation, he stood and shared his thoughts. He spoke of the love he had heard described in Christianity, of the peaceful message that resonated with him, even though he wasn't ready to fully embrace it. He admitted that his heart was open to learning more, even if it was a step into unknown territory. He said that while Islam had shaped much of his life, he didn't want to close his mind to other beliefs. He didn't directly question his faith, but he admitted that the love he felt when hearing about Christianity seemed different from what he had learned at home. It was not a rejection of his upbringing, but a recognition that there was more to life, more to believe, than he had ever been taught. The moment he spoke these words, a cold silence seemed to descend upon the classroom. The other students looked at him with varying degrees of shock, curiosity, and disapproval. Ismail could feel their eyes on him, but he didn't back down. He knew what he had said was controversial, that it could bring dire consequences, but it was the truth he had to share. He didn't fully understand it himself, but it was something he couldn't deny. He didn't expect anything to change immediately, but the words were out in the open, and he had taken a step into a new reality. The days that followed were filled with a sense of unease. The tension in Ismail's school was palpable, and he could feel the weight of his actions pressing down on him. His classmates began to avoid him, some of them whispering behind his back. It wasn't just his classmates that he had to worry about. His teachers, too, began to look at him with suspicion. His once peaceful existence in school was now overshadowed by the dangerous idea he had voiced. Despite the internal turmoil, Ismail tried to remain focused, going through the motions of his school life. But the doubt that had settled in his mind was no longer just curiosity, it had become a silent rebellion. A seed planted deep in his heart. When Ismail returned home that day, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. His family was strict, and his father was known for his unwavering devotion to the faith. Ismail knew that if his father ever found out what he had said in school, there would be no forgiveness. The punishment for questioning the faith in his family was severe, and the shame would be unbearable. But Ismail also knew that he could no longer deny the stirring in his soul, the sense of a new path that was beckoning to him, despite the dangers that lay ahead. That night, Ismail prayed in silence, his heart heavy with the weight of his own words. He didn't know what he was asking for, only that something within him had changed. He could no longer ignore the pull towards something deeper, something greater than what he had been taught. As he knelt, the darkness of his room seemed to close in around him, but in his heart, a small light began to flicker. It was fragile, almost imperceptible, but it was there, and Ismail knew that whatever happened next, he couldn't go back. The truth, as he had spoken it, had begun to take root in his soul, and there was no turning away from it now. Ismail's life, which had once seemed so straightforward, began to unravel in small but unsettling ways after his candid speech in class. The words he had spoken about his openness to other religions, particularly Christianity, started to spread among his classmates like wildfire. It wasn't long before whispers and murmurs filled the hallways. At first, it was just a few students approaching him with hesitant questions, asking him to elaborate on his thoughts. They were curious, unsure, and somewhat captivated by the new perspective he had introduced. They asked about his views on Jesus, on the teachings of the Christian faith, and what it was that he found compelling enough to speak openly about it. In such a deeply conservative environment, Ismail, still somewhat surprised by the attention, answered their questions without thinking too much about the consequences. His answers were simple, not aggressive, just honest. However, what began as innocent curiosity quickly took a turn for the worse. The more people heard about Ismail's words, the more divided the school became. Some of his peers, those who shared the same faith as he did, began to view him with growing suspicion. Their eyes followed him with judgment, and soon enough, they began to avoid him altogether. In a school like his, where unity and adherence to the traditional values were paramount, Ismail's deviation from the norm was seen as an affront. Some students began whispering behind his back, calling him a traitor, a blasphemer who had dared to speak against the sacred tenets of Islam. The pressure mounted when a few of the more devout students confronted him directly. Their faces hard with disapproval, they questioned his faith, accusing him of straying from the path and even suggesting that his words could lead to severe consequences. Their condemnation weighed heavily on Ismail. He had never before felt so alienated, so exposed. What had started as an innocent question in class, a mere exploration of his own thoughts, was now spiraling into something far more dangerous. The students who had once been his friends now avoided him, and those who didn't avoid him looked at him with open hostility. He could feel their eyes on him during every break, their cold stares a constant reminder of the guilt they had placed upon him. But it wasn't just his classmates who noticed the change. His teachers, too, began to take an interest in his behavior. They had always viewed Ismail as a quiet, obedient student who never questioned anything. His sudden openness about other religions didn't sit well with them. At first, it was just a passing remark here and there, a word of warning disguised as concern. But it wasn't long before his teachers began to take action. They would keep him after class, asking probing questions about his beliefs, their voices filled with underlying judgment. They reminded him of the importance of adhering to the true faith, warning him that his soul could be in peril if he continued down this path of doubt. The more Ismail tried to explain himself, the more the tension mounted. He didn't understand why his simple curiosity was causing such a commotion to him. It seemed perfectly natural to want to explore other faiths, to learn about what others believed. It wasn't that he was rejecting Islam. Rather, he was trying to understand more fully what faith meant, beyond the rigid walls of the teachings he had always known. He didn't see any harm in sharing what he had felt, but to the people around him, his words were nothing short of heresy. It was as if he had opened a door that shouldn't have been opened, and now the consequences were beyond his comprehension. The pressure continued to build throughout the week. Ismail noticed how even the smallest of his actions were being scrutinized. He had become a subject of conversation, a topic of gossip and judgment. His peers would glance at him, some of them in fear, others in scorn. No matter where he went, he couldn't escape the whispers that followed him. It felt as though he was walking through a cloud of suspicion, his every move under the watchful eyes of those around him. He no longer felt safe in his own skin. One evening, during a Muslim holiday celebration at his home, his mother, who had noticed his growing silence and withdrawn demeanor, asked him what was wrong. She observed that he had been more distant lately, his usual bright demeanor replaced by an almost palpable sadness. She had always been attentive to his needs, watching over him with the care of a mother who had invested her life into raising him. According to the family's strict beliefs, his silence hadn't gone unnoticed, and she was concerned. His eyes, once filled with youthful energy and enthusiasm, now seemed clouded with confusion and inner turmoil. Ismail had always tried to protect his mother from the struggles he was facing, but that evening, he could no longer keep it inside. He explained to her cautiously what had happened in school. He told her about the conversation he had had during the religious studies class, about how his classmates had started asking him questions about Christianity and how that had snowballed into something much bigger than he had ever anticipated. His voice faltered as he admitted that some of his classmates had started calling him a traitor. His words hung heavy in the air, and he could feel the tension rising in the room. When his mother heard this, her face went pale. She had always believed in the importance of preserving the family's honor, especially in the eyes of their community. To her, what Ismail had done was an unforgivable transgression. She could not understand how he could have spoken so openly about another religion, let alone express admiration for it. Her shock turned to fear, and she grabbed his shoulders, her hands trembling. She told him, with a mixture of horror and disbelief, that he had violated a sacred law. In her mind, Ismail's words were not just a mistake. They were an act of rebellion, one that could bring ruin to their family. She told him that such actions carried serious consequences, not just within the family, but in the larger community. She spoke of how anyone who strayed from the faith could face exile, punishment, or worse. Ismail, despite the weight of her words, felt a strange sense of confusion. He didn't understand why something so simple, so innocent, could be considered such a grave offense. To him, it had been a moment of personal honesty, not a declaration of war against his faith. But his mother's reaction showed him just how dangerous his curiosity had become. He had opened a door that, once passed through, could never be closed. As the conversation ended, Ismail's mind was left reeling. His mother's fear, her pain, and her anger echoed in his thoughts long after she had left the room. He sat in his room that evening, alone with his thoughts, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. He had never meant for things to spiral out of control. He simply wanted to understand more, to ask questions, to see the world outside of the narrow confines he had grown up in. But now he realized his desire for truth had placed him on a dangerous path, one that could lead to his family's disgrace, if not something much worse. The seeds of conflict had been planted, and Ismail could no longer turn back. The first spark had ignited, and he could feel the heat of it pressing in on him from all sides. He had started something he couldn't undo. The consequences of his actions had only just begun to unfold. Ismail's life had begun to shift in subtle yet profoundly unsettling ways. The whispers, which had started as mere murmurs, grew louder and more malicious. The students who had once been his friends began to distance themselves from him. They no longer met his gaze with the same warmth, and the familiar faces in the hallway now averted their eyes, as though they could not bear to be seen with him. Ismail had become an outsider in his own school, and the pressure that mounted with each passing day was palpable. He could feel the eyes of his classmates on him, and the weight of their judgment seemed to follow him everywhere. The taunts began. First, it was small things, casual jabs and snide remarks thrown in his direction when he walked through the school corridors, but soon, the teasing escalated. Some students started calling him names, mocking his beliefs and calling him a traitor to his faith. They whispered about him in the corners of classrooms, and Ismail felt the sting of their words like a physical blow. The laughter that once filled his school days had been replaced by hushed conversations and uncomfortable silences. He tried to ignore it, to pretend that it didn't affect him, but deep down, he knew that his place in the world had shifted. His peers seemed to take pleasure in his discomfort, and their disdain only deepened as the days went on. The worst part, however, was the sense of betrayal he felt from those closest to him. The friendships he had cultivated for years began to crumble. Students who had once sat beside him in class, sharing jokes and stories, now turned their backs on him without a word. It was as if they had all collectively decided that Ismail no longer fit in. Some of the more devout students, those who held to the strictest interpretation of their faith, began to target him with open hostility. They called him a heretic, an infidel, someone who had lost his way. The pressure to conform was suffocating, and Ismail could feel the walls closing in around him. He had never imagined that something as simple as speaking about his own beliefs could lead to such an overwhelming and intense backlash. It wasn't just his classmates who made him feel like an outcast. The teachers, too, began to treat him differently. His once favorite subjects now felt like trials. In one of his classes, the teacher, who had always been warm and encouraging, now gave him a cold, judgmental stare whenever their eyes met. The lectures, once engaging, became unbearable. It felt as though every word he spoke was under scrutiny. Every thought he had was being measured against the harsh judgment of those around him. The once supportive environment had turned into a battleground where Ismail's every action was being examined, dissected, and criticized. The turning point came when he was summoned to the principal's office. The principal was a man known for his rigid stance on religious matters. He had a reputation for being stern, unyielding, and committed to preserving the traditions of the community. Ismail's heart pounded as he walked into the office, his footsteps echoing in the quiet halls. He had always respected the principal, but today, that respect was overshadowed by a growing sense of dread. The principal, sitting behind his large wooden desk, looked at Ismail with a mixture of sternness and disappointment. Without preamble, he began to speak, his voice calm but filled with authority. He told Ismail that his comments about Christianity had caused unrest among the students and had threatened the unity of the school. He reminded Ismail that, as a student in a religious school, it was his duty to uphold the values of Islam and to avoid expressing opinions that could be seen as a challenge to those beliefs. The principal's words hit Ismail like a punch to the gut. He had expected to be reprimanded, but he hadn't expected this level of condemnation. He had been so focused on expressing his thoughts, on finding his own truth, that he hadn't considered the consequences of his actions. The principal told him, in no uncertain terms, that he must never speak about Christianity again, that such discussions were not welcome in the school. Ismail's heart sank as he realized the gravity of the situation. This was not just a matter of personal belief. It was a matter of conformity, of obedience to the established order. Leaving the principal's office, Ismail felt a sense of numbness settle over him. He walked down the hallway, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't process. He had expected to face resistance from his peers, but the severity of the principal's warning had shaken him to his core. It wasn't just about a disagreement anymore. It was about the very essence of his identity and the consequences of stepping outside the boundaries of his community's expectations. That night, as he lay in bed, Ismail's mind was filled with confusion and fear. He had done nothing wrong in his own mind. He had simply expressed what he felt, what he believed to be true. But now, it seemed as though his very existence was being called into question. He wondered if he had made a mistake, if his desire for truth had led him down a path that was too dangerous to follow. The weight of his actions, the weight of the consequences, was heavy on his heart. Ismail began to isolate himself further from the people around him. He no longer participated in the conversations that once brought him comfort. He kept his thoughts to himself, unsure of who he could trust. Even his family, who had always been his support system, seemed distant. His mother, in particular, was still visibly shaken by his comments about Christianity. He could see the worry in her eyes whenever she looked at him. The bond they had once shared seemed strained, as if something precious had been lost between them. The fear of being ostracized, of being condemned not just by his peers, but by his own family and community, weighed heavily on him. He had never felt so alone in his life. The isolation was suffocating, and every step he took felt like a step further into the unknown. The world he had once known, the world of certainty and tradition, was slipping away from him, leaving him with nothing but doubt and fear. It wasn't just the external pressure that was starting to break him down. It was the internal conflict as well. He had always been taught to respect his elders, to follow the rules, to be obedient to the teachings of Islam. But now his heart was torn. He felt a deep yearning for something more, something beyond the confines of his upbringing. And yet, every time he considered speaking out, every time he thought about following his heart, he was reminded of the consequences that awaited him. The pressure from all sides was becoming unbearable. Days turned into weeks, and the pressure continued to mount. Ismail's thoughts grew darker, his spirit heavier. He could feel the walls closing in, the space for his own beliefs narrowing. It seemed as though there was no way out. The sense of dread and isolation began to consume him, and he realized that there was no easy path forward. He had crossed a line, and the consequences were only just beginning to unfold. His world was no longer safe, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could hold on to the beliefs that had once defined him. In the weeks following the incident at school, where Ismail had openly shared his thoughts on Christianity. The atmosphere around him grew increasingly tense. It was as if the very air he breathed had thickened, weighed down by the silent but palpable threat that hung over his every move. At first, Ismail thought it was just his imagination, but the subtle changes in how people looked at him, how they whispered behind his back, were undeniable. The tension in the hallways grew unbearable, and Ismail could feel it in his bones. Something was about to happen, and he could sense that it wouldn't be good. One morning, as he walked through the crowded school corridors, his gaze briefly met that of an older student, someone who had once nodded at him in passing, someone who had been an ally in the past. But today, the student's eyes were filled with anger. His expression twisted with a look Ismail couldn't quite place. It wasn't just disapproval, it was something far darker. The student's lips curled into a sneer, and he took a few deliberate steps towards Ismail, closing the distance between them with an air of purpose. Ismail's heart began to race as the older student approached. He couldn't understand what had changed. The whispering had escalated, and now this confrontation. His instinct screamed at him to retreat, but there was nowhere to go. The hallways were packed with students, and even if he turned and ran, it wouldn't have mattered. The older student, a leader among the devout group of Muslims at school, grabbed him by the arm with a force that left Ismail no chance to escape. The grip was unyielding, and Ismail felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. His body was frozen with fear as the older student's eyes bored into his. A few moments later, Ismail found himself being dragged through the hallways, the eyes of his classmates following him, their stares like daggers. The whispers grew louder, and some of the students even pointed, as if to mark him as a symbol of disgrace. The older student's grip tightened on his arm, and Ismail knew something was terribly wrong. They weren't just taking him to the principal's office, this was different. This felt like something far more sinister. The group of students, led by the older student, steered him toward a door at the back of the school. It was a small, forgotten door that led down to the school's basement. Ismail had never ventured there, and as he was pulled down the narrow stairs, a sense of dread overwhelmed him. His heart thudded painfully in his chest, and the silence of the group was suffocating. The only sound that filled the space was the heavy breathing of the students, and the occasional muttering from the older student, whose grip on Ismail seemed to tighten with every step. When they reached the basement, Ismail was shoved into a cold, dimly lit room. The air in the basement smelled musty, stale, and oppressive. The only light came from a single flickering bulb. Overhead, Ismail tried to gather his thoughts to understand what was happening, but the fear in his chest kept his mind racing with confusion. He knew the other students were still watching, waiting, and Ismail couldn't help but feel the weight of their gaze. The whispers in the hallways, the stares, the judgment, all of it had led to this moment. The older student stepped forward, his face hardening with resolve. He said nothing as he motioned for the others to hold Ismail still. The other boys, all older than him, obeyed without hesitation, pushing him down into a chair. Ismail's body tensed as he struggled against their hold, but there was no escaping their grip. His heart was pounding so loudly in his chest that he thought it might burst. He couldn't understand what was happening, but deep down he knew that his life would never be the same after this moment. One of the students, who had been standing quietly in the corner, stepped forward holding a small, sharp knife. Ismail's eyes widened in horror as he realized what was about to happen. His throat tightened with panic, and for the first time since the ordeal began, he found his voice. But it was too late. His pleas for mercy fell on deaf ears, and the students seemed unmoved by his fear. They were not there to listen to his words, they were there to carry out their judgment. The knife was raised, and Ismail tried to turn his head away, but the older students forced him to face forward. His eyes filled with tears as he understood the gravity of his situation. There would be no escape from this. There would be no second chance. With a swift, brutal motion, the knife descended, and Ismail felt an excruciating pain as it sliced into his tongue. The world seemed to spin around him as the room filled with the sounds of his gasps, his body trembling with the shock of what had just been done. His mouth flooded with blood, and he could barely breathe through the pain. The silence in the basement was deafening as the students stood around him, watching. Ismail's heart raced in his chest, and he could taste the metallic tang of blood in his mouth. He wanted to scream, to fight back, but all he could manage was a muffled sound that escaped his lips. His thoughts were a chaotic blur, and the pain in his mouth seemed to consume him entirely. He couldn't understand why they were doing this, why they had chosen this moment to punish him. He had only shared his thoughts, his beliefs. Why had it come to this? For what felt like an eternity, Ismail sat there, his body trembling, his mouth bleeding, and the world around him darkening. The students eventually backed away, leaving him in the cold room, their footsteps echoing in the distance. Ismail's mind was a haze, and as he fought to steady his breath, he realized that he had just crossed a line that he could never return from. This was the price of his thoughts, of his desire to speak out, and he could already feel the weight of the consequences settling in around him. The basement felt like a tomb, the air thick with fear and silence. Ismail didn't know how long he sat there, unable to move, his body too weak from the shock. His tongue throbbed with pain, and the blood that filled his mouth made it hard to breathe. But even through the agony, a single thought remained in his mind. He had spoken his truth, and now he would pay the price. The world outside had no place for someone like him, not anymore. And as the reality of his punishment settled in, Ismail understood that the freedom he had sought had come at a price, one that would haunt him forever. Ismail awoke in his room, his body drenched in sweat, his throat raw with pain. He tried to sit up, but his muscles screamed in protest, each movement bringing with it a sharp, biting reminder of the torment he had endured. His neck, where the marks of the cruel punishment had been etched into his skin, burned with a fire that refused to subside. The searing agony of his mutilation was nothing compared to the emptiness he felt deep inside. His tongue, once his tool for communication, was now gone, stolen from him in a violent moment that had erased his ability to speak. The silence that enveloped him now was deafening, a constant companion that filled the spaces between his thoughts. But it wasn't the physical pain that consumed him. It was the emptiness, the loss of his voice, the inability to share his thoughts with the world. In a world where words were everything, he had been silenced, stripped of the one thing that had allowed him to express his beliefs, his feelings, his very soul. The anguish was unbearable, yet as he lay there, his heart burned with something far stronger than the pain in his body, something that transcended the fear and the hopelessness that threatened to swallow him whole. It was his faith. Even in the face of such immense suffering, his faith remained unbroken, like an ember in the dark, flickering but not yet extinguished. Despite the silence that now governed his life, Ismail knew that his belief in what he had shared and what he had said could not be taken from him. No matter what they had done to his body, they could not take away the truth of his heart. His mother had come to him the night of his return, her face pale, her hands trembling as she had rushed to his side. She had tried to soothe him, to calm him, but no words of hers could reach him anymore. She wept, desperate for an explanation, but the only sound in the room was the quiet rasp of his breathing. She didn't understand. How could she? How could anyone truly understand what he had gone through? How could they comprehend the depth of the pain that tore at him from within? The gnawing emptiness that only grew stronger with each passing hour. While Ismail's family scrambled to cover up the incident, to shield themselves from the shame that had now befallen them, Ismail remained in his room, alone in his silence. His tongue, his voice, both were gone. There was no one to talk to, no one to share his thoughts with. His mind raced, but his lips remained sealed. His once vibrant world, filled with sounds and conversations, had become an endless void, a quiet prison where the only sounds were the beat of his heart and the whisper of his breath. It felt as though the very essence of who he was had been stolen from him. Without his voice, he was not just isolated from those around him, but from himself as well. And yet, in this profound silence, something began to shift. Ismail found solace in the stillness, a strange comfort that came not from the absence of sound, but from the presence of his thoughts. His prayers, his faith had not been diminished by his suffering. If anything, it had grown stronger. Unable to speak aloud, he began to pray in the silence of his mind. The words he could no longer speak were now whispered in his heart, and each prayer was an act of defiance against the suffering that sought to break him. In the quiet of his room, he would close his eyes, imagining the words of his prayers flowing like a river inside of him. His thoughts became his prayers, his faith became his strength, and in those moments, he was more connected to his belief than he had ever been before. His pain, though excruciating, did not erase his faith. It only deepened it. His body had been broken, but his spirit remained intact. As he lay there, with the weight of the world pressing down on him, Ismail realized that the silence he had been forced into was not the end. It was a new beginning. He no longer needed words to express his devotion. His heart had become his sanctuary, and the prayers he whispered within it were just as real, just as powerful as anything he could have said aloud. In the stillness, he found a deeper connection to his faith, one that was not dependent on the approval of those around him, one that did not need validation from others. His faith was his own, and no one could take it away from him. Despite the agony that still clung to his body, Ismail felt a sense of peace begin to settle over him. It was a strange peace, one that came not from the absence of suffering, but from the acceptance of it. He knew that he was walking a path that would be filled with more hardship, more isolation, and more pain. But he also knew that he was not walking it alone. His faith would guide him, even in the darkest of times. And that knowledge brought him a kind of comfort that nothing else could. As the days passed, Ismail continued to pray silently. His room became his sanctuary, the only place where he could still be himself, the only place where his thoughts could still be his own. The world outside his door had grown quiet, as if holding its breath, waiting for him to break. But Ismail did not break. He endured. The silence, which had once felt like a suffocating weight, became a source of strength for him. It was in that silence that he learned the true meaning of faith, not in the words spoken, but in the belief that persisted even when everything else was taken away. Even though the silence was heavy, it was also liberating. Ismail had no choice but to rely on his faith in this new world of silence. There were no more debates, no more arguments, no more voices telling him what he should believe. There was only him, his faith, and the quiet whispers of prayer that filled the space where his words once resided. The world had taken everything from him: his voice, his friends, his sense of belonging, but it could not take away his connection to God. His spirit remained untouched, and in that, he found the strength to endure whatever lay ahead. The days passed, and though the pain never fully subsided, Ismail began to understand the deeper truth of his suffering. It was not just the loss of his tongue that had changed him. It was the realization that faith was not something to be spoken, but something to be lived. It was a lesson he had been forced to learn the hard way. But now, in the silence, he felt a profound peace. His voice might have been silenced, but his faith would never be quieted. It would speak louder than any words could, and it would guide him through the darkest of times. Time passed, and Ismail became a symbol of quiet defiance, a hero to those who had heard his story. His name spread, whispered among those who admired his strength and resolve. He had lost his ability to speak, yet his silence spoke louder than any words ever could. People saw him as a living testament to the power of faith, a figure who had endured unimaginable pain without breaking, who had kept his convictions despite the overwhelming pressure of the world around him. Yet, for all the admiration he received, Ismail never saw himself as a hero. He did not seek praise, and he did not long for recognition. His purpose was never about making others see him, it was about making them see the truth that lived within him. His silence became his greatest form of testimony. In the early days after the attack, when his mouth was still raw, when the pain in his body had yet to subside, he had questioned everything. He had wondered if his faith was strong enough to withstand the trials he faced. Would he be able to endure the emptiness, the isolation? But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, something inside him began to shift. The pain, though excruciating, became less about the physical wound and more about what it represented. The silence that had been forced upon him was no longer a punishment, it became a sanctuary. In the quiet, Ismail found peace. It was in his silence that he began to hear the voice of God more clearly than ever before. A voice not in words, but in the stillness of his heart. Ismail's days were now a quiet rhythm of prayer and reflection. His body, though weakened, had become a temple of sorts, a place where the sacred and the profane no longer existed. Each moment, without words, felt like an offering, a sacrifice of his own will, and each prayer, though unspoken, was a conversation with God. In the absence of human voices, he found himself drawing closer to the divine. His heart became an altar, and his soul, unburdened by the need to explain itself, began to find clarity in its longing for truth. He learned to live in the moment, to let the silence wash over him and fill him with a sense of purpose that went beyond the confines of language. In his quiet solitude, Ismail also became a figure of inspiration to others. His classmates, who had once scorned him, now looked at him with a kind of reverence. They saw the strength in his eyes, the resilience in his posture, and they couldn't help but wonder how he could endure so much and still stand tall. They saw that he had become something greater than they could ever have imagined, something they could never truly understand, but something they couldn't ignore. His quiet service, his willingness to live out his faith in the face of such adversity, became a testament to them. In the face of such severe punishment, Ismail had not been broken. He had not given up. His resolve to live by his beliefs without fear of what might come next became a symbol of hope to those who had been silenced in their own lives. As the weeks turned into months, Ismail began to understand that his silence was not a barrier, it was a bridge. It connected him not only to God, but to others who, like him, had been silenced by fear, by tradition, or by the weight of expectation. He could see the longing in their eyes, the quiet questions they dared not ask, and he knew that his example had given them the courage to ask those questions, to seek answers. They, too, were learning that freedom of thought was not something that could be given or taken away by others. It was something that was born from within, a light that could never be extinguished as long as they held onto it. Ismail's life had become a mirror for others, a reflection of what it meant to live authentically, to be true to one's beliefs even when the world demanded conformity. And in that reflection, they found the courage to stand up, to speak out, or in some cases, to remain silent, but with the certainty that their silence was theirs to control. Ismail's mother, though initially devastated by what had happened to her son, began to see him in a new light. She had watched him endure the pain, the isolation, and the rejection, and in his silence, she saw something she had never seen before, a strength that went beyond the physical, a strength that came from within. It was a strength that she had never imagined possible, and it was one that she had never taught him. In his silence, Ismail had become a living testament to the power of belief, not as a doctrine, but as a way of life. It was in his unspoken faith that he had found freedom, and it was in that freedom that he had found peace. The town around Ismail had begun to change as well. The pressure to conform had always been strong, but now, as the whispers about Ismail's quiet courage spread, more and more people found themselves questioning their own beliefs, their own traditions. Some still clung to the old ways, but others began to see that there was another path, one that was not defined by the restrictions of society, but by the freedom to think and believe as they chose. Ismail had unwittingly become a catalyst for change, a symbol of the quiet rebellion that comes not from words, but from the courage to live one's truth, regardless of the cost. Despite the reverence he had gained, Ismail never sought to be a hero. He didn't want others to look at him and see someone who had triumphed over adversity. He simply wanted them to see the truth that he had found. His faith was not about glory or recognition. It was about the quiet, everyday act of living according to what he believed to be right. It was about finding peace in the silence, and knowing that even without words, one could still bear witness to the truth. And so, Ismail continued to live his life in the silence that had been forced upon him. He prayed in his heart, he served in his own quiet way, and he lived each day with the certainty that his faith would never falter. His body had been broken, his tongue had been silenced, but his spirit had remained unyielding. He had become a living testament to the power of faith, not in the words that one speaks, but in the life that one lives. His silence had become his confession, his offering to God, a confession that spoke louder than any words ever could.